We are ready to get started with our first panel, which examines Imagining Peace in the Middle East. We're pleased to have Ambassador Greta Holtz with us this morning as moderator. Ambassador Holtz is president and CEO of Amideast, a leading nonprofit organization engaged in international education, training, and development activities in the Middle East and North Africa. She was previously the ambassador to Oman, and over her 35-year diplomatic career, held other leadership positions such as Chargé d'Affaires in Doha, Qatar, Senior U.S. Coordinator for Operation Allies Refuge in Qatar, Minister Counselor for Provincial Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, and Consul General in Damascus, Syria. She has also served academically as Chancellor of the College of International Security Affairs at the National Defense University, and is currently a Distinguished Senior Fellow for the Global and National Security Institute. I'll turn the discussion over now to Ambassador Holtz, who will allow her panel members to introduce themselves. She'll facilitate the discussion and then lead the question and answer that follows. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Holtz.
Thank you very much. Can you hear the mic? Is it working? Okay. So before I let the panel members introduce themselves, I want to thank you, Jim, for that introduction. And I really want to thank General McKenzie for pulling this together and for your continued leadership in this realm of national security affairs. You're now an official academic after having been what I would consider a warrior diplomat. It was a great honor to have worked with you when you were CENTCOM commander. So thank you for continuing service to our nation in this thought leader field and in the voice of foreign policy, national security policy for our country. So thank you. So we'll turn to each panelist to say a few words about their background as by way of introduction. Sean?
So my name is Dr. Sean McFate. I am a professor at the National Defense University and Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. My background is I am not a Middle East expert. I'm a war expert, and so I'm here to talk about that dimension of the solution.
Hi, my name is Negar Mortazavi. I am a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, foreign policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. I also edit and host the Iran podcast, a weekly English language podcast on Iran. If you haven't heard of it, please tune in. And I come from the world of media journalism. I'm a veteran journalist, bilingual English and Persian. I worked with a range of media, mostly focusing on Iran, US-Iran relations, and also the broader Middle East, which basically any part of it also relates to Iran. And happy to be back here. Thanks to the GNSI and General McKenzie and everyone for organizing another great conference, and excited to be on here with everyone.
Thank you. Lucy?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen, and I direct the program at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington on Israel, the Palestinian territories, Egypt, and the Levant. And my primary focus for many years has been on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, broader set of Arab-Israeli dynamics, both at the political, diplomatic, and civil society levels. It's really a pleasure to be here this morning.
Thank you. So it's very hard to go as a panel after General McKenzie, who covered everything and brilliantly, I think. And I was going to address the whole Gordian knot, untying the Gordian knot theme until every single speaker before me did that. So I'll just throw that card away. But as we figure out how to get to peace, however the parties to that conflict and the United States define that, and how we as the U.S. try to help play a helpful role in getting to peace, the first job, to very loosely paraphrase what renowned military strategist Karl von Clausewitz advised, the first, most far-reaching act of judgment is to establish the kind of war we are dealing with. So having worked with Dr. McFate before, he is a war expert. I would like to ask him to help us think about what kind of war we are looking at and experiencing in the Middle East right now, and how understanding the answer to that question can help us define the elements of peace. Right, Sean?
Sure. So very briefly, we all know that this is a wicked problem. It's a Rubik's Cube, whatever metaphor we want to use, right? Before we understand the nature of the solution, we better understand the nature of the problem. And the conflict in the Middle East right now between Iran and Israel is one that's been going on for quite a while now. It is not a quote-unquote traditional war. It is a very modern war. In fact, traditional wars, like conventional wars, they may be past their expiration date. And we have an international community whose architecture for war and peace is based on traditional war and not modern wars, organized, international organizations, the laws of armed conflict, you name it. So we have to think a little bit beyond that to understand this conflict, which is a shadow war, as General McKenzie was saying. War has been driven into the shadows in the last couple years, decades. The reason is because geopolitics has changed. We live in a hyper-information age. Everybody has one of these. Everybody now is a journalist, a witness, a videographer, a publisher anywhere in the world, and that changes warfare. If you want to get away with warfare, whatever that means to you, it's best to do it in secret. And ends, like means and ways, if you will, that give you plausible deniability can be more powerful than raw firepower in the modern age. And this is partly why Iran has adopted a shadow war strategy for, I think they started to do this after they witnessed the US first Gulf War, after their, years of a bloody stalemate with Iraq. They saw the US come in and annihilate the Iraqi forces in days. And they said, well, if we're going to compete with the US, we got to think differently. And so they started to create a shadow forces like CUDs, Special Operations Forces, their proxy forces, all of which is a way to give them some plausible deniability. Not to fool foreign intelligence agencies, but they want to fight beneath the threshold of global media, the threshold of this, because once the international spotlight is on them, it changes their strategy in ways they don't welcome. Now, Israel learned this the hard way in 2006 when it invaded Lebanon. It won the battle but lost the war. They fought a conventional fight. They captured more territory. They killed more enemy. They flew their flag over southern Lebanon, yet they still lost, and they knew it. And Hezbollah won. So they spent the last 10 years after that thinking about how do we improve this? And they came up with a new defense strategy in 2016. And their shadow war, or their kind of warfare in this environment, is called the war between wars. The war between wars. And so now what we're seeing is that this is all culminating together. We can't think about this as an independent, like here's Hamas, here's LHA, as General McKenzie was saying, we have to think about this holistically. Now, there are guardrails to prevent wars from escalating, which is the nature of war, by the way, is to escalate. Many of those guardrails are traditional, and traditional things may not work in this war. But one of the good things about shadow wars is that they offer multiple off-ramps from escalation, because they allow all actors to back down and save face. One of the things that made the Cuban Missile Crisis a crisis was that it could have both the Soviet military and the American military were potentially fighting in the same grid square. It could have gone nuclear within hours. Most of the Cold War was fought under the threshold of knowledge or reporting. That is sort of going on today. It presents new opportunities to allow new off-ramps. So we have guardrails that are traditional. We also have off-ramps. So we need to be more clever in greasing some off-ramps and prohibiting others so we can achieve some sort of untying or slashing of that knot people talk about.
Thank you. Thank you. Lucy, I'm going to ask you, in thinking about what Sean said and looking at this war today, it's different perhaps than what one might have expected. Are there presumptions that military planners, foreign policy analysts have or had that this war has disrupted those presumptions?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that the question is very apt, because when I look at, again, I'll use this term, this Gordian knot that we're using today, this metaphor we're talking about, I think that the reason this is such an entangled intention set of threads is because this is just a series of assumptions that have been upended across the region. In October 7th was an initial upending of an assumption, certainly from Israel and other analysts' perspective of what Hamas was either capable of or willing or inclined to do. You saw upending, we heard in General McKenzie's remarks, he mentioned Iran's April 13th direct missile attack on Israel, another upending of an assumption, a crossing of a red line of what Iran would do, how directly it would attack. Would it just stick with its attacking through its proxies, which had been a long-standing assumption? The Houthis, an upending of assumptions about what they had either the capacity to pull off. Again, something else we heard in the introduction, I think the number was it 60% of shipping having been disrupted, and the broad impacts that has. And I think that you have, the list goes on, and I think when you have this kind of upending of assumptions and what had been broadly understood rules of engagement, it is making the deterrence, the threat calculation and the assessment of how to establish deterrence extremely challenging for all actors. And that's actually where I worry about, and I'd be interested to hear more about the off-ramp, because it seems to me that what's missing right now, as everybody's been thrown off kilter, is understanding exactly where each other's red lines are and where you can find those off-ramps. When I look at the inability to get to a ceasefire in Gaza, I think the sheer scope and scale of what we've seen unprecedented in the history of this war for both sides, you've had Israel feeling the need to fiercely reestablish deterrence, and the Hamas leadership right now feeling the need to double down as they have gained some leverage with one of these upended assumptions. And so to me, I see that's where I see the off-ramps further off than they might have been in more, if you can call it, traditionally bounded times.
Thank you, guys. So before we get into more questions, I want to make sure that you have time to make any prepared remarks, which you may or may not have. Nobody has prepared remarks? Okay, good. We'll keep on with the questions. So Negar, can you explain a little bit about what you think, following General McKenzie's comments, what is Iran's regional policy perspective? What do they want? And, are there areas of any common agreement for strategic goals between Iran and Israel and Iran and the US? It's like 3 questions.
Thank you. All great questions. Let me first start by sort of laying out and going a little back when it comes to Iran's regional policy, because I think one thing that we tend to happen because of the news cycles also is to look at these events on their own, not really going back and sort of understanding what leads to another. From Iran's perspective and the broader allyship, or as they call it, the axis of resistance, this sort of loose network of militants, state and non-state actors across the region that they work with. And I don't always think it's completely accurate to refer to them as proxies, because then that gives us a sense that they're being run with a push of a button from Tehran, and that's not really the case with Hamas, with Hezbollah, with Houthis. They each have different relationships with Iran. They essentially were organic movements on the ground in their respective countries, and at some point Tehran saw an overlapping of interests, of ideology, of strategy, or a combination of all of these, and towards a sort of a shared goal, or shared goals, smaller or bigger goals. But the Houthis are very different from Hezbollah. Hezbollah is very different from Hamas, and the militias, the Shia militias in Iraq, and also from Tehran in itself, that we always see as sort of the top of the pyramid. Tehran's perspective on this sort of setup across the region is that they see this as a forward defense, is what they refer to it, as a strategic depth, essentially being able to have an unconventional, as Sean was also explaining an unconventional way of fighting back a very powerful force, which is the Israel in the region, which when it comes to warfare and capabilities, no other country or force can match it naturally. And also the supporter of that force, which is the United States, the most powerful army in human history, I would argue. So they've essentially set up this system for a war of attrition to be able to essentially launch, or as Sean is saying, war between wars continuously go to be able to counter the other side in unconventional ways. And that's essentially the essence of Iran's regional policy if we look at it and if we try to understand it. And we always have to take note that the Iranians are looking back to their war with Iraq, which wasn't an unconventional war. This is in the 1980s under Saddam. The Iranians refer to that war as the quote-unquote imposed war, Jang-e Tahmili, a war that was imposed on them when Iraq attacked Iran. They call it the Difaa Muqaddas, the holy defense. And it was a very brutal war, very deadly war for both sides. It went on for 8 years. And after that, the strategy in the past 3 decades, I would say, has been that we in Tehran, the thinking is, we are going to move the war away from our soil, our land, and even away from our borders. And that's what you hear constantly in a talking point in the military and political apparatus, that if we don't fight these wars outside of our borders, we would have to fight them in Iran, we would have to fight them in Tehran, in Hamadan, in Isfahan. And so that has been sort of the overall general motto, and in also sort of setting up a force or a combination of forces to be able to fight this very mighty and powerful enemy that obviously they can't match. And as General McKenzie, the only force that has nuclear weapons in the region with the support of the United States. But when it comes to today, I think we're dealing with sort of an interesting paradox because, and I want to emphasize, when we talk about Iran, it's not a monolith. It's not a one-man show. There are different political factions. There are competing political factions. We just saw a president who died in a helicopter crash of the ultra-conservative, hardline side of the political spectrum be replaced by a fairly moderate reformist president. So I think the signals we're getting from Tehran is that they're benefiting from this war. They're benefiting from seeing Israel weaken and tied down in these multiple fronts with these multiple forces of the resistance, the so-called acts of resistance. But at the same time, they don't want an all-out war. They don't want a repeat of an Afghanistan situation in the region. They don't want a repeat of Iraq. They don't want boots on the ground of American forces for obvious reasons, because that would just be, I think that's actually something nobody wants in the region. So they're threading a very fine line of how do they, and I think this applies to each side, to all sides. How do you escalate to de-escalate? How do you, as Sean said, take the off-ramps to sort of establish deterrence for the other side, or cross a previous red line without being blamed for escalating into that all-out regional war? And I think, in my view, this conflict has only expanded in the past 10 months into multiple fronts. It's ever expanding with the recent events in Lebanon, the Northern Front in Israel. And so that threat is very serious, of this turning into a bigger and longer regional conflict. So I think, going back to your last question, Greta, where does the interest overlap, at least between Iran and the US? I think the unwillingness to be pulled into an all-out war, into another endless regional conflict that I think none of the two sides want to engage in. But at the same time, understanding the other side's red lines. There are no direct channels of communication really between Iran and the US. It also relates back to Iran's nuclear program, the falling out of the JCPOA and the Ukraine war, Iran siding with Russia, souring relations with the Europeans, all of that. So it's also difficult when, in a time of conflict, you don't have those diplomatic channels to be able to communicate and to understand. So in April, and I'll just end it with this, but in April we saw an episode of the Israelis crossing a previous red line, and this is in the on the shoulders of years of shadow war between Iran and Israel, where both sides had an understanding of each other's red lines and sort of were able to keep that war in a box. But the Israelis attacked the Iranian consulate in Syria, and Tehran interpreted that as crossing a major red line. And so for the first time, the Iranians attack Israeli soil from Iranian soil. And I think this is, again, goes back to the paradox. The attempt or the intent that they were signaling and messaging was that we are escalating to establish deterrence and sort of going back to those previous red lines. And then we saw the Israelis also attack Iran from Israeli soil, but that, at the end, it created an off-ramp, and sort of they both went back to maybe not where they were before, but sort of that shadow war in a box with an understanding of the red line. So I think we see episodes like that can get very dangerous, that can turn into a major escalation, be a watershed moment, but at the same time, there are off-ramps that I feel like there are still forces in the US, in Iran, in Israel, and even in Lebanon that are sort of pushing for that de-escalation or the temporary de-escalatory methods, or taking the off-ramps while the conflict still continues and I think grows.
Thank you. Anyone want to comment on what Negar said? And do you guys also think that perhaps Israel and Iran are looking for off-ramps by escalating? Sean, what do you think?
Well, I think the April attack was interesting. I mean, they both could have done more, and there are pragmatic reasons why Israel had restrained. General McKenzie explained those. But I do think that their objectives were to put it back in the box. I mean, if you look at shadow wars elsewhere, occasionally they bubble up to the surface and they become like, New York Times headlines, and they're on Sky News. And then usually a lot of sides, they try to bring it back into the shadows where they feel they have more control. Libya is an example of this, right? And there's others like this as well. So there is a certain strategic logic to shadow wars that we need to see if we can master, so we can help de-escalate it into the shadows and then maybe further escalate it. But towards the particulars of Iran and Israel, I do defer to those who have more local expertise than me.
Yeah, thank you. I think I agree very much that what you've seen are signs of Israel and Iran, and until now, I'd say Israel, Iran, and Hezbollah looking for those off-ramps, as we're calling them. I worry, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that the more the rules of the game become unclear, the more room there is for miscalculation, and the easier it is to just speed past those off-ramps and find yourself somewhere that you don't want to be. That increasingly, there's been this phrase you keep seeing, that the regions are the boiling point, and I feel like we've been watching this pot boil for a long time, and it sort of seems to keep getting up there and then going back down to a simmer. The one actor in this that with initial calculations probably wasn't, and it does relate to this, was looking to escalate, was Hamas initially on October 7th. And it's been interesting in relation to these other actors we've been talking about to see how they've been navigating this, because I think Hamas's hope was that these other actors, who are only partners in the sense, and I take very much Negar's point, to proxies is a little bit of an all-purpose word, because some are more partners, some of they're supported to varying degrees by Iran. But to the extent there's a kinship there, I think Hamas was very much hoping for an all-in support from these other Iranian-supported partners, and it kind of got it, as they'd say in the region, yani. It got it, sort of kind of half measures. It's had all these actors, the Houthis, Hezbollah, they've come in. They've come in the name of what's going on in Gaza, but they have not joined the all-out fight, which I think was the signal early on that they were not looking to escalate. And as we've noticed, as they've tried to look for those off-ramps in recent weeks, as there's been ongoing ceasefire talks, you've seen at times when these tensions have boiled, you've seen these actors say, well, we're going to hold on a response to the latest provocation, whether Hezbollah and Iran specifically, to see if there's a ceasefire in Gaza, to give room for those talks. And the way I read that is this was a way to, if you don't really want to get pulled into a war, but you want that face-saving mechanism, if the ceasefire talks had been accomplished, then they could claim that victory of having helped bring about a much needed ceasefire in Gaza. But increasingly, as the prospect of those talks, which I agree become more and more, prospects of those talks that seem to become more and more unlikely, that off-ramp is now, the buying time to see if that's going to happen is slowly eroding. And so this is where I worry that the miscalculations when everybody's trying to reestablish their red lines and what deterrence means could lead to, could find yourselves outside of that campaign between the wars and fully in the war. Thank you.
Any comments or additions? Okay, Lucy, I will stick with you then, please. Could you talk a little, General McKenzie talked a little bit about the Gulf states' relations with Iran, and could you talk a little bit about any prospects you see on regional normalization? So we had the Abraham Accords. Is there any possibility of an Abraham Accord-like relationship between the Gulf states and Israel? They don't all look at Israel as their existential enemy, as we know. But what about Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt? Regional normalization, I guess, with Israel and with Iran.
Sure. So I think that, one of the, I mentioned a series of upended assumptions in my initial answer. Maybe one of the original, we've been sort of dating the timeline almost from October 7th today, but go back a handful of years to one big upended assumption, which was when the Abraham Accords were signed in 2020. And this notion, right, the assumption that upended was this whole paradigm of sort of enshrined in the Arab Peace Initiative that the Arab states would not normalize relations with Israel until there was a Palestinian state, or at least a clear pathway toward a Palestinian state. Now that had been upended by Egypt and Jordan already, but beyond that, this big coup when the Emirates and Bahrain primarily, and then followed suit Morocco, normalized relations, this was an upending of assumptions. Now, another assumption baked into that was that, this notion that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict had to be resolved in order to bring about stability and integration, that assumption has been upended. Now, take us again, this is why I think the knot metaphor is a very good one, because it's all these points in tension. One could argue that what you are seeing since October 7th is a reminder that those relationships, as important as they are and as much as an achievement as they are, this move towards regional integration with an eye towards greater stability, for as long as they serve as a bypass road around that issue, may not be able to fulfill their very much needed potential. So you've seen, and it's interesting to watch how these relationships are fed. And I think the next panel is on this, so I probably don't want to get too much into it now. But you've seen sort of a mixed bag. You look at April 13th, the attack that we keep talking about, and even in the face of the strain on relations with the ongoing war of Gaza, you saw these partners play a role in preventing Iran from doing as much damage as it could have done. At the same time, you have seen aspects of these relationships to varying degrees go on hold, freeze, go a little bit more under the radar, but have still shown their staying power, and for various reasons that maybe we can talk about in a follow-up question. On Iran, the question I think you're asking about Iran normalizing with the Gulf, I mean, one of the assumptions behind the Abraham Accords, the motivations for it, was that Israel and these countries share a common strategic security interest in seeing Iran as a shared threat. But certainly the UAE, who was the prime driver of the Abraham Accords, has pushed back a lot on that being the driving factor, right? They've said there are many other reasons. That's a factor, and the Emirates in particular, you've seen, has has tried, I think, to underscore that, and it's not alone, by somewhat normalizing, healing to some extent rifts with Iran in recent years. I see this by these countries as hedging, right? You're in a very insecure environment. If you want to minimize the belligerent engagements that you have with your neighbors, and so I think it's a mixed bag. I don't think for these Gulf actors this is zero sum, that it's Israel or Iran. I think again it's an effort to bring about as much stability on these countries' borders as they can, and particularly for some of these countries like the Emirates, like Bahrain, which are small, for whom this stability is increasingly important. The one actor in here, of course, I haven't mentioned, is Saudi Arabia, and we may recall that in the March up to October 7th, there was this. There was an increasing assumption that you might be getting close to normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And again, another prong of analysis there that did not evade the notice of Hamas in terms of timing of the attack on October 7th. And so I think the question, and maybe it's something again we can get into later, is where does that go now? What is certainly clear is that the war and its consequences and its inability to come to an end is certainly putting efforts towards putting that back on track, slowing that down significantly. But I do think that that's where dynamics are heading and where interests are heading eventually. But untying this knot in the meantime is going to have to happen, I think, before we see more development on that. Whether it can be a pathway to untying this knot is another question.
Thank you. Negar, on Iran, as General McKenzie mentioned, his thought that a two-state solution is the only solution between Israel and Palestine. Will Iran always be a spoiler in that, because they need that revolutionary enemy so they can continue to espouse their credibility with their people? What do you think about that?
Depends on who you ask in Iran. Again, it's I think there are competing debates and factions, but if we want to look at a trajectory of where the revolutionaries started about 4 decades ago, the chants of the revolution were death to America, death to the Soviets, also death to Israel. I think that has, I would say, the policy or the understanding has transformed, and I'll give you a few signs. Iranian officials wouldn't even refer to Israel as Israel. They wouldn't even acknowledge the name of the country. It was either the Zionist regime or the land grabbing regime or the don't talk about it the regime, don't name it regime. We just have the Iranian president in New York now sitting and referring to Israel as Israel. I think this goes back to maybe General McKenzie's point, looking at it from the other side, and I took a note that Iran is not going away. I think that understanding is now being more and more quietly understood in Iran, that Israel is not going away, that Israel is staying in the region. It's powerful, it's a UN state, UN recognized state, and all of that. And so, but how does Israel stay in the region? I think that, again, going back to the comments and and sort of at least the public messaging of Iranian officials, we're seeing more and more of rather saying Israel, must leave the region, must be wiped off the map, and all of that, now turning into what the Palestinian wants. There are even talks of a referendum, or all inhabitants of the land, which I think these are slow and indirect and maybe quiet, unofficial ways of sort of saying that we understand that Israel is not going anywhere and they're also here to stay. I think going back to October 7th and just elaborating more on what Lucy says, that I agree. Even the relationship between Iran and these partners or allies in the resistance are different. And I would say Hamas is probably the furthest of all. Hamas, maybe the Houthis, if you want to look at them as sort of dominoes, and then the closest would be Hezbollah and the Shia militia in Iraq. I think after October 7th, also the public messaging that came from both Tehran, from the top, even the Supreme Leader himself, and echoed by Hezbollah, was that this was a Palestinian operation. This was they praised it but they also try to distance themselves, at least from the operation. This was a completely Palestinian operation, which means we had nothing to do with it, or we're trying to signal that we had nothing to do with it, and sort of going back to that independence of the Palestinians and what they want, which again, I think is an indirect way, an unofficial way of essentially saying that, you know, we are giving up on the dream that Israel will go away, and I think they're here to stay. And just yesterday, I think the Iranian president had an off-the-cuff moment with the press in New York, where he said, and I'll try to be as direct with the quote as I can, that we're willing to put down all our arms if Israel is willing to put down all their arms. Going back to disarmament, which is an impossible ask, but I think it's signaling an intent, at least from this faction of the Iranian political structure, the reformists or moderates who have the administration now, who came out as winners of the presidential election, that they're interested in de-escalating and sort of prioritizing diplomacy. The JCPOA team is back in Iran. The foreign minister is the former deputy to Javad Zarif. The former foreign minister is now a VP. The foreign minister is Abbas Araghchi. His deputy, Takht Ravanchi, Gharib Abadi. You look at that whole group of diplomats who are part of the JCPOA negotiating team, they're sort of back. And I feel like the system, the state, as we call it, the Nizam, has sort of handed back the foreign policy file, at least with the West, with the US, on the nuclear issue, to that team, to the reformers, to the JCPOA, which is a signal that, you know, they're interested in de-escalating and not getting pulled into that bigger regional conflict. Now, again, this also goes to all the paradoxes that Lucy was explaining as far as miscalculating. It's a volatile situation. When you escalate, thinking you're de-escalating or you establish deterrence, you may be violating major red lines that are seen differently by the other side. But I think overall, we're still a long way from any form of accepting or normalizing between Iran and Israel. But I think we're at least also further from where the revolutionaries used to be 40 years ago.
Are we any closer to normalizing or making less of a flashpoint Iran's relations with its other neighbors, not Israel? So the Gulf, Egypt, other countries?
I think so, yeah. So we saw a sort of rapprochement or an agreement or deal, however they call it, between Iran and Saudi Arabia after years of no diplomatic relations, and that it came as a surprise. It was brokered by China. And I think we're hearing, actually it's a divergence of these different factions, because it was the hardliners or the conservatives who delivered that, the normalization with Saudi Arabia or the rapprochement. And we saw the current president, the reformist, actually praise that in his, on the campaign trail. So the reformists slammed the hardliners for ruining the relationship with the West, with the US, messing up on the nuclear issue, bringing all these sanctions, but he praised them for the normalization with Saudi Arabia. And I think that's something that they're intent on keeping and continuing. Same with the UAE. There has been an improvement in relations with Egypt. And I think that's an understanding, again, in the system that we need to be able to live with our neighbors, maybe not all of them, but at least more other than less.
So just on that, is the US able to play a helpful role in encouraging those relations, or should we stay the heck out of it?
I think the US can, maybe not by being front and center in everything. I think when the Iran-Saudi deal came and it was announced that it was brokered by China, a lot of people in Washington were heartbroken that, oh, why did China do that and not us? I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for the US to not always be front and center. And, the US can't always solve or untie all the knots in the Middle East. And sometimes it's more helpful to either stay out or not be the primary or the leading party. And I think this also, if we try to understand, not necessarily agree or support the other side, but understand their thinking, the whole sort of glue that brings this entire axis of resistance together. What is resistance? It's their resistance to what they see in outside interference in their region, in their neighborhood, in their place of living, by a foreign force, which is the United States. So at least a big chunk of, maybe not all or half or whatever, I don't want to put a percentage on it, but a chunk of that region doesn't necessarily see all U.S. involvement as positive to the fact that they're even resisting it. Exactly. So I think it's a combination of going to your question of, trying to lead using leverage where you have leverage. So for example, with your very close allies with Israel, I think the United States has immense leverage when it comes to Israel, and I don't think that leverage has been utilized fully in a push for peace. We hear that the administration is working around the clock to bring a ceasefire and all of that. I just don't think that push towards a ceasefire for a release of hostages also, which would also, stop the fighting, the civilian suffering in Gaza, that just hasn't happened. So there are areas where the U.S. can have more influence, they have more leverage. Obviously, that's more with allies. And then there are areas where, with the rivals or tangentially, the U.S. can either stay out or at least not take a leading role.
Thank you. So of course, this Gordian knot in the Middle East is not a knot in a vacuum. It brings in the great powers, and the great powers have interests in it. Sean, what do you think great power competition, how does it impact the Middle East, and how does the Middle East impact great power competition? Small question.
Okay, I'll just, thank you for that. So first of all, there is some nostalgia in Washington for the Cold War, and I think we should resist that. Some people look at the Suez Canal crisis, et cetera, and there are some things to be extracted there, but let's not look too closely because it's quite different. And to Negar's point, I think maybe it's actually a stabilizing effect that China is playing a role. I mean, I don't, and Lucy was mentioning this too, it is not a zero-sum game, right? So, the defense establishment in Washington, not the diplomatic, but tends to view things in sort of zero-sum. They arise, I think that there are ways that we can work together. It might be a little messy, but we've done messy things in Syria and Iraq with, multiple, like with Russians, and not always worked well, but it has happened. I think we have to look to the positives of GPC in this context, and not just sort of poo-poo it. Now, there are many who are also very concerned that China's getting its fangs into the Middle East. And I think some of those concerns have to be listened to. But also, I think, you talk to China experts, at least in, again, Washington, right? The bubble of Washington. And there's two varieties. One is like, they're going to take over the world by 2049, start your Mandarin right now. And the second is, they're going to implode, don't worry about it. And it's sort of like there's not a whole lot of middle ground, at least, I'm not talking about the experts, I'm talking about just generally. So I think that we should look in this circumstance to the opportunities of GPC to create stability, not victory, not defeat, stability. So that's, I'll just try to be optimistic with that.
Any other thoughts on great power?
I think I would just add that I'd pick up on the last point that Sean made, which is since we're a panel entitled "Imagining Peace in the Middle East" and trying to find ways to sort of forward look and prescriptively or optimistically at least. I think looking for opportunities is right. Picking up on Negar's point. That sometimes maybe does the U.S. have to be the lead actor in everything? No, but the competition and the dangers and the concerns about great power and these other powers in the region are very, very real. But the question is, are there ways to find places? There's going to be intense areas of competition and of conflict. Are there areas where there are common interest? I think the problem is when intentions aren't trusted. We just mentioned China's role in bringing about the Saudi-Iran normalization. You saw China bring together in Beijing the different Palestinian factions recently to try to bring about some kind of reconciliation, or it resulted in some kind of declaration of same. But to the extent these things are performative more than meaningful, or intended towards bringing peace and resolution of conflict as opposed to just part of the greater circle competition. I think that's, and posturing, I think that's where it's hard to unpack. I think that on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the interesting thing, again, in the vein of looking for opportunities in the most optimistic vein of things, this is an area, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one where China, Russia, and the United States have had the same articulated policy end goal for many years, what used to be what was called the International Community Consensus of a two-state solution. So that is a policy goal on which they have not differed. So at a point at which one ever could envision getting back to diplomacy on this issue, this is a role. I mean, we saw it in the early 90s with the US and Russia hosting the Madrid conference. It was a very different time in US-Russia relations. But the point is, I think that ultimately these will require coordinated efforts, probably with the US playing the sort of chef d'orchestre role, the coordinator of all these efforts, because I think ultimately its role will be needed. But I don't think it's something it will ultimately be able to do alone. So I think looking forward ahead to the future, finding those areas of converging interests are where you would start to try to find a pathway forward. But again, with the lack of trust and intentions and beyond right now, I think it's hard to see that taking place.
Good. So wicked problems. We started, trying to help negotiate a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Now we've got Hezbollah in there. I don't have a crystal ball to see what is going to happen in the West Bank, but what are the elements to getting a ceasefire with Hamas that are not happening? In other words, we're trying our best. The Qataris are trying. The Egyptians are trying. Tony Blinken's been out there. Bill Burns. What are we getting wrong? Anybody? It's a tough question.
Look, I think at the end of the day, the two leaders negotiating, if not directly, but the heads of the two parties in this case who are instrumental are the ones who are going to want to come to an agreement. And I think as I mentioned before, the calculations of both of these parties at this point are such. I think Hamas, I think Sinwar, till now has assessed that he's gained leverage through this, right? The more damage, the more destruction, the longer this goes on, it does feel like a little bit of a going for broke kind of attitude. And as he sees and watches and assesses where world opinion or pressure is coming on Israel, he keeps hoping that will increase the leverage, and it reduces his incentive there. And I think we began to see that turning point as well, where this was heading when we saw a couple of weeks ago the murder of the hostages. That this is we now know what we're looking at in terms of this not coming to an easy endpoint. And I think one of the big sticking points that we've consistently heard mentioned as one of the sticking points in the agreement is whether or not Israel will fully withdraw security control, particularly from key geographic areas. One that's consistently mentioned is the Philadelphia corridor, which is that strip between Gaza and Egypt. Israel is arguing that for security purposes and to prevent the rearming of Hamas through its tunnels, it needs to maintain a presence there. Hamas is saying that it won't agree to a ceasefire without a full withdrawal. So that has been understood to be a full sticking point. And again, you have a challenge here because, I say it's two sides, but you have Israel and Hamas aren't talking to each other. The US doesn't talk with Hamas. This is all being done. You've got Qatar and Egypt. So this is all being done through different sets of intermediaries, which makes an already incredibly difficult negotiation even more complex. And again, all these actors have some leverage to bear on the respective parties. Are they all using that leverage to its full effect? Probably not, all around. And all these actors have their different interests at play in that regard. Of course, for Egypt as well, the Philadelphia corridor, this is something very sensitive. We go back to relationships between Israel and its neighbors. Egypt has said that Israel's insistence to stay in the Philadelphia corridor could threaten its agreement, its treaty with Israel, because it sees that, as articulated that, as being a violation of that treaty. So again, you have a lot of actors in the mix here, and not a lot of will, as I'm seeing it, from the leaders who most matter and who are most going to have to make that decision.
Thank you, thank you. Sean, looking back in history, other peace processes, are there any models, and you mentioned the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war, are there any models we could look to help us untie this knot? There's ceasefire, and then there's peace process. So
Right.
do they have to go in that order? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think that it's a great question. I don't think 2006 is going to apply here, because the scope is so much bigger, and the stakes are much higher. So I do think one thing to think about is that, ultimately, when it comes down to it, war is armed politics, right? We can get the armed part right and forget the politics, and that leads to winning battles and losing wars, which is what Israel discovered in 2006. You can get the politics right and the armed stuff wrong, and you get like World War I, right? But I think how you sequence it, having worked, I was in Africa for many years, I think armistice might be armistice of some sort might be the first stage, and to create some strategic breathing room around it. So, and then to get it to de-escalate into those shadows, which are complex, dangerous shadows, but they're better than those two countries playing tennis with missiles all the time. But remember that there are these proxies, and Negar's point's well taken. They have their own will, and they can play spoilers. And the thing that we can't forget is that Hamas figured out the template about how to crush Israel. They did this because of the Abraham Accords. Everybody got a slice of that pie but them. They wanted to stop it. They did, and they did it on October 7th, and hostages were the center of gravity, and that's the sticking point between the ceasefire. And those two forces will not move, I don't think, because why would Hamas give up those hostages? So how can we find this? This might cause some controversy. How can we find the solution set, but it doesn't involve Hamas, which the Abraham Accords didn't really either? So what kind of a long-term solution is it? And I don't know the answer to that, but I just think that they're going to play spoiler, because why would they move off of their X? I don't know.
Negar, what do you think?
I think these are more in the form of questions. I'm not sure if Hamas can be ignored, or sort of this envision that, or the talking point we keep hearing, Gaza after Hamas, Gaza after Hamas. I don't know if that's really a possibility. We haven't seen that really happen or get very close in the past 10 months. It's been a very heavy military campaign, but can you really bomb sort of a movement? I mean, call them whatever they are, but there is an organic grounding. It is resisting to something, and I think that's the core of the problem, which if that's not resolved, if the Palestinians are not given the, however it's negotiated, sovereignty, a state, a self-determination, I don't think this problem will go away. It may not be called Hamas, it will have a different name. And sort of assuming that I think that's the problem, and by the more powerful force in the region, is that when you have a very strong hammer and you see everything as a nail, you just try to hammer everything that you assume is a nail. And I don't think this is just a nail problem. Yes, it's a very complex problem, but this idea that you can just get rid of Hamas, have the hostages back alive, which hasn't happened in the past 10 months, we see, and sort of have this problem go away and go back to where the Abraham Accords were and all of that. I think all of that calculation has changed, the dynamic has changed, and it just won't, the Palestinian issue can't be ignored and everything else sort of be resolved in the region without that.
Yeah, so Lucy, I see you're nodding kind of in agreement. How do you address the entire Palestinian issue in the middle of this multi-front war with great powers and regional powers?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree very much with what Negar said. I mentioned before, and this was not an original phrase, but somebody when we were first, a colleague when we were first talking about the Abraham Accords, talking about, can it succeed? Will it be a bypass road around the Israeli-Palestinian issue or a bridge to it? And I think, again, this is one of the tensions that we've seen explode. And I know, General McKenzie was talking in his opening remarks about how, this is not the central problem in the region. It certainly is not the central problem, but it is used very effectively to galvanize and to fuel a lot of other problems. And we're seeing that now, again, with these proxies partners we've talked about. It can get conveniently latched onto and grasped hold of. So it does have a power to inflame. And the challenge, I think, that I hear Negar pointing to is and I think this points to your last question as well about why is this ceasefire so hard to get to, the prospect of it. I think that everybody seemed to agree. I think that nothing can go back to the way it was on October 6th, but nobody seems to agree on, and therefore, where it needs to head is. And the absence of this sense of what happens again, this after, often the term that's used is day after, but and often it's used just in relation to Gaza, but it is just, there has been so much, again, upended, I keep using this same word here, so many assumptions upended, so many different red lines crossed, that without some kind of vision forward, I don't think the going back to the, just going back on the off-ramp back to the shadow wars, I think we're past that point. So the challenge now is to chart this path forward. And I think without a vision, again, for how you rebuild, literally in the case of Gaza, but also more sort of broadly metaphorically rebuild on a pathway towards a kind of a more permanent diplomatic solution to this conflict. That is the challenge now, and that's a challenge that vision comes with leadership, and I think that there is, that's another question that maybe we can get into in the Q&A.
Thank you. So now I think we will turn to questions from the audience, but I want to thank you guys for taking my questions and for helping us think about these very wicked problems.
First question, do you think encouraging cooperative frameworks like regional economic partnerships or security alliances can reduce tensions between rival nations?
So I would ask anybody who would like to answer that. It's kind of a generic question. Good question. So, Sean?
I mean, in theory, yeah. I mean, I think, we can talk about what they call sticky power, which is economic interdependence, creates stability. Of course, there's sanctions and so forth involved, and Negar could talk more about what that might look like. Sort of cooperative frameworks are good in theory. Can those, but remember that ultimately, for some sort of strategy or course of action to work, it has to be, one, feasible, it can actually deliver, but two, it's got to be acceptable to all the parties involved. And one of the things about sneaky war is that it kind of takes, you can save face. You can tell to your domestic audience, it's easier to sell things if the bad stuff happens in secret. And there's lots of pros and cons to this. I'm not an idiot. But I think that is a geopolitical feature of this conflict too, is that sneakiness. So, but in terms of economic potential, maybe Negar.
Just on that too, I just want to ask, because the Palestinians, or some elements of them, are party to this conflict, but they're not a state, how does that factor in to all these arrangements which the parties to the conflict are not a part of.
Let me just quickly comment on Iran and economic sanctions. I believe Iran is, if not the most, but one of the most sanctioned countries, and a lot of it by the US. Broad economic sanctions targeting basically every major industry in the country. And as many in the field call it, and Iran watchers, they've been sanctioned to death almost, but they didn't die. Did these sanctions, these broad economic sanctions, really bring the policy goals? The goal is that you use sanctions as a form of leverage, as a form of pressure to bring policy change or to force Iran to change its behavior. And I don't think that's really happened. Now, research is showing more and more that, yes, sanctions have been effective in impacting the economy, impacting the life of the average Iranians, middle class, working class. The Iranian middle class has shrunk. Iranians are getting poorer. Poverty line is getting higher and higher. But as far as the policy change, basically, and this is what we see in every internal debate, just most recently in the presidential debates, basically the moderates blame the hardliners for bringing all these sanctions and then for bringing them to sort of go out and clean it up. So there's incentive in part of the political structure to resolve this issue, but it hasn't really brought that policy change. So it can be used as a form of leverage, but it's a double-edged sword. If you just use it to hammer, but don't also, so it's sort of a carrot and stick situation. If you don't ever see it as a carrot and use because if you put sanctions and you need some form of change, you have to be prepared to remove it. I feel like in Washington, it's just piling sanctions over sanctions without the thinking and the preparedness or the perspective of ever removing them. And they sort of lose that leverage or pressure point as far as bringing policy change. And I think that's what's happened in the case of Iran. Most of this impact of sanctions hasn't really been the intended shift, but rather the unintended consequences on the civilians, on the average life of Iranians.
I would just briefly add that I think this idea of regional cooperative relationships bringing stability, absolutely, and yes, and also they have their limits. So if we go back to this arena we're talking about, if we think about how long-standing now, particularly the Egypt-Israel peace treaty has been, the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, and more recently these normalization agreements, even in the face of strong tension now. Egypt and Jordan, though, have been these really pillars of stability that they brought about for years, certainly in a bilateral sense, even among some incredibly tough challenges, but have remained cold pieces to this day. And that very much is due to the lack of resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which, again, to the point you mentioned, I think that these players, these Arab countries have served the role you asked about the Palestinians not being a state. Because of that inherent asymmetry in the dynamic there, these Arab states have often helped bolster that leverage of the Palestinians, stood in for that leverage that they're missing because of that. And you've been, the advent of these agreements and the distancing from that over time has had an impact there. And again, we've discussed how that, I think, helped feed in as well to some of the dynamics that Hamas took advantage of on October 7th.
Can I ask a quick question? Do you think that it's possible to have a non-state-centric framework?
A non-state-centric framework, broadly speaking?
Well, we have non-state actors involved.
Yes.
Who are part of the conflict. Why do we have to privilege states?
I'm just responding to the question is you have a region, the question of cooperative relationships, those cooperative relationships I can only envision between states.
Yeah, I'm asking, can we have a different model for that? No?
Something I'd have to think about.
Okay.
What would you envision?
Well, I don't know. They have political power. They're political actors. I think we're being very 19th century and we think that states are the only actors in international relations. You have multinational corporations, you have Elon Musk, you have all these different types of figures out there, and maybe we have to rethink what diplomacy means in the 21st century. I'm not saying we should bring Elon Musk, God forbid, into this problem. Okay, I'm just saying that maybe we should think a little bit creatively, and maybe the answer, Lucy's right, that like really without, the international architecture is really structured for a state-centric framework. I mean, that might be the answer. I'm just posing it to the general audience. Is it possible to think beyond that? That's all.
Any takers?
Well, that's a great question. Well, it depends who you talk to about Hezbollah, right? I mean, they're a part of the Lebanese government. Are they really? I mean, it depends who you talk to. This is an ongoing debate. China doesn't view them as terrorists. So, we have our own, and maybe the answer is you're correct, we don't, okay? But we're looking, this knot is super tight, and maybe we should start thinking very broadly, and then Mike decide, okay, we don't really want to go there. But I think it needs to go on the table. That's all I'm suggesting.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you. Next
Okay, different topic here. The decarbonization of global economies is adjusting the region's strategic importance. What part might this play in regional stability in the coming 3, 5, 10 years?
I'm going to see if anybody wants to take
I'll say
that
something
one.
on that. I mean, I think that's another, I mentioned before that there was pushback by many of the Abraham Accords partners, and very much so by the Emirates, consistently on this idea of the Abraham Accords being agreements forged against as anti-something, i.e. Iran, but also being forged for positive, proactive reasons, for a more positive, proactive vision. That has been a lot of the framing you've heard. And I think that with a view of some of these countries who have been very reliant on fuels, and recognizing that this change that is coming and realizing they need to diversify their economies and cannot rely on the old forms of revenue, I think that very much has been driving this push towards these cooperative agreements like the Abraham Accords, because it is a chance to develop cooperation around a whole host of sectors. And so I think it's very much relevant here, and I think it's something that the actors have been very much, you've seen them very much respond to in recent years.
Next question. Do you think that Iran's quest to go nuclear will embolden other Middle East nations to take safeguards and enter the nuclear arms race? If yes, what would be the effects of that?
I'll just go down the line.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I want to emphasize that Iran's nuclear program is still a civilian one, and there are debates within the country, especially after the past 10 months, and especially after the April episode that we talked about, of some, in the political structure, the policy realm, of talking about a potential weaponization or the need to at least discuss it. But the policy of the state is not there yet. I mean, the supreme leader has a fatwa against nuclear weapons, and I don't think that fatwa, I mean, you can always reverse fatwas, but it's usually precedent is that it stays with the person until they pass away. So I don't think the policy of the state is going to change unless something dramatically different happens. And we thought maybe the past 10 months would bring some game-changing shift like that, but it hasn't. It hasn't. Even the April episode and sort of Iran's viewing of crossing the red line by Israel, them attacking, really taking a gamble, taking a very big risk of attacking Israeli soil from their soil, and then the tit for tat, I don't think brought that conversation or that internal debate to a serious shifting point. So far it's not. It's the policy of the state is not that, is to keep the nuclear program as civilian. We just saw, as we discussed, the JCPOA team is back in the Iranian Foreign Ministry. They're interested in negotiating and diplomacy, essentially resolving the nuclear issue, meaning sort of putting back the controls or the monitories or the safeguards, which were the nuclear deal between Iran and the US, or the P5+1. But things can also change. It's a crazy world. Look at Russia and Ukraine, look at the past 10 months. So I don't want to say never. And if that does happen, if the policy does change, if the calculation does change in Iran, and if the Iranians decide to go for weaponization and nuclear weapons, I think that will definitely prompt it. Already the conversation has spread to other actors in the region, Saudi Arabia and other allies who sort of see this also. I mean, everyone sees this as a club. If Iran can join it, why not us? So I think it will just expand this race, and I see it as a problem, and this problem in the region. So. But the way to resolve that is also not through military. There's this notion that you can sort of bomb Iran's nuclear sites or bomb Iran's nuclear program and it will go away if someone just does it, Israel or the US. And I don't think that's the solution. So diplomacy, the nuclear diplomacy, I think, was what brought a solution to that problem. I was back about 10 years ago, and we're in a different place now. That deal is pretty much gone, or dead, as both sides call it. But some form of negotiation and diplomacy with international actors involved. I like Rusty's emphasis on that, on the international factor with the IAEA, which is a UN nuclear watchdog, and all of that, I think, is the way forward, looking at the success of the past also.
One question is, how sustainable are the relationships between Iran, Russia, and China, and what could cause their fracture? And I got a related question that was, what opportunities for great power cooperation, in quotes, with China should we pursue in the Middle East?
Great power.
Well, okay, I think it's a great question in terms of great power questions. Sorry, Holtz will kill me for that. But so I do think, first of all, when I said China, we should look for opportunities for China, I also just, and Lucy was talking about this, I'm not saying we should give them a propaganda victory, all right? Just to be very clear to everybody in the room. And I do think that we should, this is just McFate's opinion, be pursuing a more aggressive wedge strategy between Russia, China, and maybe Russia and Iran. Because remember, we're linking this to Ukraine, to Taiwan. We're now beyond the Gordian knot, we're in an even bigger knot. So we have to manage those politics as well. Maybe we can trade one victory off for another. I mean, we could, I don't know what this would look like, but Russia, if you help with Iran here, we can lessen something over there in Ukraine. Those are the types of horse swaps we're going to have to think about. But I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think we have to start with all of our mutual interests that we do share in common and build from there rather than antagonistically. And I don't know if anybody really wants to see the Middle East blow up. So I would start with that.
I think Iran's relationship with Russia and with China are again, going back to the revolution. It's a young state, so it's only 40 years. You can always reference back. The slogans of the revolution were freedom and independence, no to the East and no to the West. And I think over the past 4 decades, essentially the state has realized that you can't just live without the rest of the world. So yes to the East and yes to the West and yes to the neighbors by different degrees and depending on who's in power and which faction has the upper hand. But I think Iran sees Russia and China, Russia as a military partner, both of them obviously big world powers, veto powers in the Security Council, important diplomatic partners. With Russia is more of that military partnership. They've been partners in Syria on the same side. In Ukraine, Iran is, I would say, reluctantly, or at least by some faction, at least the way they're framing it, siding with Russia. With China, it's more of a trade partner sort of relationship. China has been very helpful to Iran in sort of helping them circumvent sanctions, being with banks or the buying of oil. And I mean, they're benefiting from it too, of course. But It's different relationships, sometimes strategic or out of convenience. But overall, I think it's also diversifying their look. So the hardliners blame the moderates of always looking to the West, and the moderates blame the Iranian hardliners of looking too much to the East or relying too much on Russia, who's betrayed Iran before, historically, in many instances, or to Russia, who's not a natural partner. So I wouldn't say any of these relationships are very, historic and solid, and they're basically dynamic and they can change, but they're also strategic in sort of diversifying, understanding that if your talks or diplomacy or even deals with the West doesn't work, you're always going to need China. You're always going to need Russia. And so I don't think the relationship will go away, but there's a lot of room to maneuver and a lot of internal debates in Iran and how strong or how close the relationship be. Is it really worth siding with Russia and its attack on Ukraine, which Iran has nothing to do with? I don't see much interest, and sort of to preserve that relationship the way Russia wants, and then also lose the rest of Europe because of that siding. These are internal debates and sort of challenges and discussions that are happening in the Iranian political space.
I think I add briefly, and it's a bit of a repetition of something I mentioned before. Look, I think right now the Middle East is being seen as the perfect arena by some of these great power competitors for forcing the competition and needling the U.S. I think that the U.S. has hemorrhaged a lot of soft power in the region over the course of the last 11 months in relation to the war in Gaza, the inability to bring it to an end. And I think that has provided just a ripe opportunity that has been seized by great power rivals to show their influence. I think in an ideal sort of forward-looking world, right, if we get to a point where the Middle East is not just a playing field for great power competition, but the focus can be on the shared interest in that regional stability, there are shared interests there. And again, on the diplomatic sphere, I think that's eventually where those would have to be brought to bear, but we're unfortunately far from it right now.
Okay, next question. The panel has spoken about attempts at de-escalation quite a bit. But what might cause a major escalation, either intentional or accidental?
I think accidental is the worst. Nobody wants that. Of course, it's, World War I comes to mind, accidental warfare. But I think that, for example, imagine that Israel blames Iran for the actions of its proxies and decides, okay, we're going to actually bomb Iran until you get, you endure pain, you get the message, stop with the proxy wars, and where does that lead to? How does this end? So, that is a fear I have, and of course, lateral escalation is always a fear.
I think this idea, aside from accidents that I agree with Sean, but this sort of idea that both sides have, or multiple parties have, that I'm going to do this escalatory move to establish deterrence, essentially seeing their own escalation as a de-escalation, but doing the opposite for the other side. Every time each side escalates, the other sees it and frames it as a major escalation, a changing point, but then for themselves, they see it as established deterrence. I think that is bound to eventually fail at some point or the other. And we've really only seen escalation in the past months. I haven't seen I can't really pinpoint any major de-escalations that has pulled the war back into any of these fronts. Like all of the fronts in Gaza and the Northern Front and the Red Sea, it's only been sort of either at the same stage it was or sort of expanded, especially now with Lebanon, then we see the news coming. So I think it's just these small steps, how small you see your own step on your side and how big the other side sees it. And what do you anticipate as a response or a no response, whereas the other side, and also with the lack of direct communication, with all these mediators, having to bring the two sides together, it's very dangerous, and it's bound, mistakes are bound to happen, or miscalculation of what the other side sees your move and how they interpret it and how they're going to respond.
Sorry, and as you pointed out, there's more than two sides. There's just many fronts, so thanks. Lucy, we're good?
I'm good on that question, thank you.
Okay, here's a very short question. Is there a role for the International Criminal Court, or is this just a footnote? Question mark. That's it.
I didn't hear, I heard, is there a role for the international?
Is there a role for the International Criminal Court, or is this just a footnote?
Well, the International Criminal Court has been involved already, and that is playing out. I mean, this is, again, I go back to my the point I said before, sort of when we were in this last question on great power competition and the erosion of US soft power and everything that's going on around this conflict. One of those pieces is the International Criminal Court. There's the International Courts of Justice cases. So there is a role already being played, and those cases are moving through the system. You saw them referenced the other day in a UN resolution referencing the International Criminal Court case and its need for its to be acted upon. So it is playing a role here.
Can I just add a quick point? I think there's a role. I come from the world of media, and this is as much a war on the battlefield as it is a war of narrative. So I think the International Criminal Court might not be able to change the dynamic in the battlefield, but it can certainly, and it has already impacted this war of narratives, with South Africa pushing this, with the history that comes behind that, and sort of the way they're framing the situation. I think everything that's happening in the international arena is at least impacting that war of narratives. And certainly with the International Criminal Court putting a lot of these things, in writing, on the record, people reference the case at the International Court of Justice. I think it does have an impact, at least on that front.
So I'll be the lone dissenter. I think it's going to be a footnote. Come on now. Ukraine, Hamas, look at lawfare in the South China Sea. Have any of those actors paid consequences? You look at, Hamas's attack. So I think that in my opinion, like LOAC, there's three options. We either keep the laws of armed conflict as they are, but I would argue that they're pretty much past their expiration date. We update the laws of armed conflict to reflect modern warfare, like human shields and all, in a robust way. Or three, we just say it was a noble experiment, but the project didn't work out. But I think that's where we are as a globe.
If the answer to resolution of the present conflict in the Middle East lies in proactive involvement of Middle East nations, is any perception of U.S. all-out support to Israel stopping them from intervening?
So, I think it sounds like this question is circling around this notion of the U.S. being able to be sort of an effective broker of this conflict and what will bring about effective diplomacy to end this conflict. And I think, this is, long been the question. The U.S. has effectively been the sole mediator, third party, driving mediation diplomatic efforts over many years in this conflict. And there were many reasons that the U.S. has been in that role. And I think, often people have asked, I think that the sort of last part of that question seems to touch on this. A lot of people have questioned, well, is the US a neutral broker or is it an honest broker? And I think, again, the term I've always used is effective when you're looking for a broker. I don't think it's about, brokers aren't always effective because they are seen as completely impartial, right? Sometimes the leverage they have or the relationship they have with a particular side is what makes their role particularly ripe and apt for being able to bring about a solution. We are seeing the stickiness, for want of a better word, of this conflict now of many years. You've heard President Abbas in recent years. We didn't talk at all, which says something about the head of the PA of the Palestinian president, but he for years has been saying, I'm done with US as a sole broker, we'll engage in the peace process, but only now within an international framework and a mechanism. And of course, the early successes towards the peace process were multinational. Again, it was the US in the lead, but if you think again, I've referenced already the Madrid Peace Conference, right? That was US and Russia co-hosting and bringing about, it was a multilateral process that involved very much the regional neighbors. So I think when we get there, again, that is the way we're going to have to get there. I think it cannot be done without the US. And the reason you bring in all these parties is that ideally, right, all of these different parties have different pieces of leverage to bear with the different actors. And if you can get that coordination right, whether you call it good cop, bad cop, however you coordinate and leverage those pieces of interest, that's how diplomacy is eventually going to work.
Okay, we have a few minutes left for some final closing comments from the moderator and panelists.
Yes, so I would like to open it up now to any closing comments, prospects for peace, how do we untie the knot, anything you would like to address that you didn't get a chance to during the panel.
No, I mean, I would just say, there's always this feeling, this need to find, is there a silver lining in an otherwise gloomy discussion and gloomy picture? And I think that I will pick up, when I try to look for it, well, I'll pick up on a comment I made earlier when I said that everybody seems to know what they don't want and what it can't go back to. But certainly when I look at them, maybe I'll just zoom in on the Israelis and Palestinians in this one. There is not a defined vision, though, but then what? And perhaps, that's at least, it could be, there's an opening there with leadership, which is something I mentioned, to start establishing that vision, right? If there are people looking for something different and don't know how to get there, there is leadership that can help in that regard. Public opinion is fundamentally dynamic. You have seen, picking up on this last question of diplomacy, you've seen consistently over the history of this conflict that when public opinion on both sides, in this I mean Israeli and Palestinian, have been supportive of diplomatic efforts specifically towards a two-state solution. The support for that goes up whenever there has been a meaningful diplomatic process. It has completely eroded every time those processes collapse and eroded to a lower point than before. But it is fundamentally a dynamic trend line that positive developments does in fact influence the mindset of the other. And so to the extent we're grasping here for optimism, there is there is space here for leadership to emerge, to create a vision forward, and to bring the publics on board to something that's a more positive trajectory than certainly we're mired in now.
I think briefly want to emphasize that when we talk about peace or when we talk about ceasefire, talk about diplomacy, I think one notion that is sometimes forgotten, at least in Washington, I don't know about here, is that it's a give and take. You may see yourself as a powerful party or as the just party or as the, however the perspective is, and the other side as the weak party. You have the hammer or the nail. You can just hammer the nail, or you're the just party and the other side isn't, with all the labels or branding or how the perspective, going back to also what Sean was talking about Hezbollah. I think that notion is sometimes lost. Like, how do you get to a peace, to a ceasefire, to an agreement without giving anything, by sort of without conceding or without meeting somewhere in the middle ground? And I think that's the important part. It's an emphasis on the important role of diplomats, which usually happens behind closed doors, so we don't hear a lot of the details about them. But I think that I just want to emphasize that point, that when we talk about peace, it doesn't always happen through power and military means and solutions. It ceasefire, negotiations and agreements, these are give and takes, and each party, and not just two, multiple parties, has to be prepared to, make concessions, give something, take something. And sometimes I think that's lost in the calculation, the equation, and that's where the sort of the cycle continues to be vicious.
Just very quick. I mean, I agree. Often when people talk about peace, they really mean victory. Think about that, right? Especially in the Middle East. The second is that this is a very modern war, and we have to think about it in modern terms. And a lot of what we grew up with in whatever, war college or bachelor's degree, that really may not apply that much anymore. And lastly is, and this comes from my time dealing with wars in Africa for many years, is maybe we need to be more humble about our role in this process. I'm not sure what that looks like, but I think humility might be something to consider going forward.
So I'm very humble to have moderated this panel. You guys were great. Thank you for your thoughts, the time you put into preparing. Thank you to the audience for great questions. Thank you for reading the audience questions. And again, thank you to General McKenzie for pulling us all together. Tough topic, and we've just scratched the surface. So I look forward to the rest of the events. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.